for being here again. We're going to stick with, from the last meeting, we're sticking with the same agenda. We're going to continue working through that today. So appreciate everyone's time. With the virtual meetings, it's sometimes a little tricky to do intros. So I think we'll do what we did last week, is we'll do a quick roll call and see who's here, then we'll let staff introduce themselves as we get to those topics. So from the BAC side, I see we have Kevin here. Is Beth on? I think I saw Beth.
I'm here. Good afternoon.
There's Beth. Good afternoon, Beth. Cheryl Tweedy. I haven't seen Cheryl. Okay. Don't think Cheryl's here yet. How about Greg?
Here.
We got Greg. Good afternoon. Tom, I think I saw Tom. There he is, Tom Peterson. And then Dick Steinbergy.
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, I see him up in the corner. Okay, and then Tenzin and Karen are not able to make it today. So from our Board of Education, I see we have Rita here. And then I think I saw Scott Bailey.
Yo.
Good afternoon. I don't see any other board members. I can't see everyone. Let me look at the names. Okay, well, if I'm missing someone, go ahead and yell at me. Otherwise.
Dan, Norm Dowdy here with BAC.
Oh, I'm sorry, Norm. I skipped right over your name.
Okay, thanks.
That is embarrassing. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, I think we're going to jump in. Darren Lee, do you mind muting, please? Actually, in general, if people don't mind muting until it's time to speak, that would be great. So we're going to jump in with our agenda. I'm going to present my screen. Again, we have, there's multiple ways to provide comments. We have the chat feature in Google. So please feel free to use that. I'm going to ask Marina to keep an eye on that for me in case I miss anything. There's also a raise your hand function in the upper left. If people want to click on that, they can raise their hand, and myself or Marina, she can help me out there as well. If people are talking, you can raise your hand and we'll go to you then. Or just go ahead and yell out. That's totally fine too. So let's start and let me present. Okay, I trust everyone can see my screen okay. If you can't, so where we think, yeah, June 30 restart. So here was the high-level agenda from last time. I think we're going to keep moving through this. And so our next up, and then we'll touch on a couple topics at the end that were brought up last time as well. So first up today will be the Jefferson High School budget. That is a component of one of the options that's being considered. As a recap for some of the newer members, I think it was our February BAC meeting where we looked at the 2020 bond planning numbers. We went over the conceptual master plan cost estimates for Jefferson, Cleveland, and Wilson. And based upon that feedback, we actually modified some of the assumption estimates before we made these budget numbers public at that time. So a bit of a rehash, but we want to touch on it again. And so Marina or Steve, I'm not sure who wanted to start. I'm just going to go. I'll turn over to either Marina or Steve.
Yes, this is Steve. Hi, thank you. I guess I'm going to present my screen. I'll see if that works. Okay, can everyone see the cover of the Jefferson Master Plan report?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to try to move as quickly as possible, leave some time at the end for questions. Again, my name is Steve Jefferson. I was the project manager for the conceptual master planning process for the 3 high schools. And as you remember from the last portion of this meeting, I think Dan introduced this as a process that had a specific goal to determine a high-level scope and cost for all 3 of these conceptual master plans with input from the community through a conceptual master planning committee process. So I'm going to quickly go through and kind of briefly refer to the report because it has some helpful graphics on it. Sorry, one second. Can everyone see? Yeah, I think it's several pages in on the report. So basically for all 3 high schools, we went through a process beginning with kind of a high level review of how this process would unfold, because it was, as you may be aware, it was a different process than has happened before, the conceptual part of it. So we began by looking at lessons learned from 2012 and 2017. That included lessons about the master planning process itself, lessons from the past projects regarding high school ed specs, lessons about how to cost new construction versus modernizations. And then we brought in a couple of kind of expert groups. One of them was the OSM expert group, which is basically senior project managers who were involved in these processes in the past. And they shared a long list of different categories of lessons that we kind of went over as a group. And then finally, we had 3 design teams, each assigned to each one of these projects, including Jefferson, that had their own experience on prior bonds. So they were able to share kind of their lessons from that process. We also set up a high-level steering committee that was actually a combined committee for all 3 projects, for all 3 high schools. So we wanted to get a mix of participants from the district leadership side, both educationally and operationally. We brought in all 3 high school principals. Eventually, when we had conceptual master planning committees, they decided to select a chair. That person was also involved. And then all 3 design teams and kind of our core project team. So I think the hope there was to try to share lessons through the process from one team to another, and also to have as consistent results as possible across the high schools. I think the other critical thing we did was we brought in the cost estimator, RLB, really early on. So they were involved really at the first of these steering committee meetings. And they began to talk about how they would put together each of the cost estimates and how the kind of input they would need from each of the project teams. I'll go into that a little further as we go forward. There was a lot of data gathering, obviously, through this process. We shared a common set of both OSM and district documents, from the ed specs to the district's new sustainability goals, which have been fleshed out over the past months, to the PPS resilience goals, seismic performance goals, and then the state's 1.5% green energy technology requirements. So then, as you can see from this page within the Jefferson report, we got into kind of the meat of the process. I won't go into some of the details of how we kind of did outreach and engagement, but we basically went through a similar process that we did in the past to do outreach and engagement with each of these communities, and eventually had conceptual master planning committees that were convened based on a specific set of goals for each of these high schools, for each of these projects. We went through a series of meetings, and here you can see there were typically 4 meetings, but in the case of Jefferson, we decided a 5th meeting was justified in kind of the October through December timeframe. And we also had some student engagement and also a community forum as well. We went through a process of establishing visions and goals for each of these projects, including Jefferson, and really related to kind of the meat of the program. We went through the high school ed specs and determined where each of these schools the existing facilities, how they matched up with the ed specs. In the case of Jefferson, we actually kind of drilled in further because we understood, there were some unique qualities of the Jefferson program, everything from a larger theater that is essentially considered a community asset to the dance program and all the related dance studios. So that's been a kind of a historic part of the Jefferson high school program. A lot of the support space for other partner programs. And then obviously the middle college, which is part of the collaboration with PCC. And you can see just a little comparison here between the ed specs and the existing Jefferson program. And the steering committee actually decided to increase the base square footage requirements, or the kind of the outline in the ed specs for certain programs. Like, instead of a 500 seat theater, they decided that Jefferson, because of the unique theater they have there, was justified to have 1,000 seat theater like they currently have. We added additional dance studio spaces, and we also had a more robust kind of partner program space as well.
Stephen, excuse me, this is Director DePass. Is there any way to increase the size on your screen, or alternatively link this report in the chat so I can follow along? I can't read it at all.
All right, I'm trying to make it, is that a little more legible?
Yeah, it's quite a bit more for me. I don't know if anybody else is having problems, but thank you.
Yeah,
definitely
better.
That's great. So yeah, so you can see some of the side-by-side comparisons of the existing Jefferson program space and the EdSpec space requirements. I'm going to refer to some of the technical documents that are primarily in actually the appendices, which I won't be going through because it's way too long for a meeting like this. But I think Dan, in the agenda, you included a link to both the report as well as the appendices. Is that right?
That is correct. So the materials that went out have both documents in them.
So this really led to the program development part that we got deep input from each of the committees. And I'm going to zoom back out just to give you, these are less to read and more just to see some of the images. And I don't know if people are seeing, there's basically some model images that the architect brought to each of the meetings. Whoop. Okay, it's flashing for me, but this sheet, which hopefully people can see, shows some of the constraints on the site, which had to do with ADA and seismic constraints. So each of the sites obviously had some of those unique conditions. And then it came down to each of the teams using these little model pieces to come up with, or each of the conceptual master planning teams coming up with different versions of the final two, what was decided to be final two options, preferred options that the team selected. And in both cases, they actually determined that they would keep the historic 1909 wing because it has a lot of, I think, relevance historically for the community. There are really critical spaces for them, including the main stairs that historically has been an important gathering space, the main hallway, and so forth. So that was the critical piece that was maintained in all of the different schemes, including the two preferred options. And then everything to the south of that are the additions, from new science wings to the new theater and the new gym. So at that point, sorry, I'm gonna fly down there. They went through and kind of defined the basic program for each part, both the original wing and then the new components. And then it was also critical, we got input from the Conceptual Master Planning Committee, including Principal Calvert, who was really a critical connection between the community and the district, that it was really important for for this community that the school population be able to stay close to this site, not be moved way off site to another location. So we went through a process of determining with the architects what an on-site kind of phasing and swing site approach would be. So you can see here how phase one basically involves moving the bulk of the program to that south parcel, south of Alberta. And then it focused on, and so the bulk of basically the educational spaces could be located in temporary modular structures. And then we would keep in phase two the core theater space and the core existing gym for that period of construction, so they could continue to use those. And then finally, you had the third and fourth phases, where the third phase involves moving back into students moving back into the new structures and demolishing the existing theater programs and completing a final piece, the final addition, which is also partly what takes the school capacity up to the full 1,700 capacity. And then now this is actually more just swing side analysis. I won't really go into this any further. This just shows the kind of the modular layout. So they went through in a pretty detailed way to understand what the capacity needs would be for that phase of construction for the temporary modular structures. So obviously all of that was incorporated and with the cost estimator kind of sitting side by side with the steering committee and with each project team, going through all the phasing requirements, looking at historic cost information for modernizations and replacements, obviously looking at ed specs and design standards, all of the goals that I talked about before, the sustainability, resilience, and seismic goals. And then in particular, we brought in a separate geotechnical and structural engineer to work side by side with the design teams at a pretty high level, but to understand where we were having components that had to be modernized. We wanted to make sure we had realistic kind of a structural understanding of what had to be done to those buildings to bring them up to the current seismic standards. And the other piece I think that you'll see when I go to the comparison of the high schools that Dan showed was that I think we also considered what it would take to bring not just the core gym and common spaces up to the highest, immediate occupancy level seismically, but what it would take to bring the entire school, because I think there was interest at the leadership level to understand that. So I'm going to just jump to that sheet again. Hopefully everyone can see that. So one thing that I think caused some confusion that I didn't catch before was diagrammatically A and C look like they're identical. They're not. There's sort of two different flavors of similar design. Approach A really just has two wings that come straight out from the 1909 structure, and approach C is really what you see in this image. So that's why there's a slight difference in cost. Approach C is kind of a courtyard design that's just inherently a little more expensive. But all of the swing costs, the phasing costs, as you can see, were included in the cost estimate. And then everything else was really pulled out.
Steve?
Yes.
Why don't you go ahead and transition this back to Dan's presentation, because this is the next slide in Dan's, and I'll go ahead and go through this.
Okay.
Thank you. And Dan, you are, I believe, presenting.
Well, while you're, I'll ask a question after you transition. I was going to do it during the transition, but I'll wait.
Would you like to go ahead and ask the question? I'm sorry, before I go through the slide or after?
Sure. This is Julia from Edwards. Just a quick question. I'm looking at the cost estimates, and I'm wondering, Franklin High School also used, obviously, a portion of their historic facade from 1914, and Jeff is 1909. I'm just curious, what was the final, and then my secondary, maybe this we can circle back to this later, is just the delta seems to be pretty significant between the two projects. So I'm curious about it.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first question.
Correct. I didn't either.
So my first question was, what was the final cost of the Franklin rebuild? Because it also used obviously a portion of a structure from 1914, and it seems like the cost estimation for Jefferson is, I want to say, at least $100 million more. So just wanting to understand that delta between the projects. And I understand they're very different, but it's a large sum of money, and they're both modernizations of schools that were built within 5 years of each other.
It's not actually just that they're different schools and different sites. It's also escalation plays a pretty significant role in this. So Franklin has been complete for a couple of years now. Escalation costs have gone up significantly over the last couple of years, and our escalation costs for Jefferson, because we escalate out to the midpoint of construction, those are out even more. That adding that escalation number in, and Scott Troll is going to talk a little bit about our escalation assumptions for this in a minute, so we can talk through that a little bit more.
That'd be great.
In a minute.
And I'm not asking it to be critical.
Okay.
I'm asking it more. I think we'll have people, for example, in Southeast Portland who will say, "Hey, you built Franklin for 150."
One thing I could add something, Marina, if you want.
Sure, go ahead, Steve.
Just very quickly, yeah. On a technical level too, just the addition of the sustainability goals means that the entire building envelope for Jefferson would be treated differently than it was for Franklin in terms of just energy, insulation and moisture barrier and so forth. So the level of requirements or goals are different now than they were back for the 2012 projects.
This is Kevin Spellman. I have a couple of questions before we get into the numbers, kind of about the process, I think. And this first question is not particularly just focused on Jefferson, but also Wilson and Cleveland, because we use the same process, I think. When we started this conceptual master planning process, the teams were given the ed spec and generally the similar process that had been used with the DAGs. I wonder if those teams were also given a budget to work with.
Sorry,
Okay.
I was just waiting to see if Dan was going to jump in here. Go ahead,
I can
Dan.
now that I'm off mute. So the specific, what were those teams given a budget? They were not. What they were provided was our ed specs, our design guidelines as our primary design documents, and then engaged with stakeholders and with the community around conceptually what could these three high schools look like. And we've called these conceptual master plans because they had a specific goal. The goal of them was to get a conceptual scope and then a budget that aligned with that scope. So we want a professional cost estimator to give us a number based upon what the scope of work was. And we wanted to have some of these early conversations. So if there was a specific option, or in the instance of Cleveland where there are multiple options, but the dollar amounts are very similar, then we would know that when we were budgeting for the bond, and then if the bond passed, then going into that master planning. So that was the purpose of the conceptual master plans, was to give us these high-level budget numbers.
Okay, I have here's where I'm going with these questions. You know, with the 2017 bond, as soon as it was discovered that the funding was inadequate, there was a big question before the board. Did we promise the taxpayers a certain scope, or did we promise the taxpayers a certain budget? And the board selected the scope over budget, and that's a totally legitimate choice to make. So my question, though, here is, what is the status of these conceptual master plans vis-a-vis the board? Have they been accepted, approved, whatever term we want to use? And if we were to proceed to a 2020 bond based on, you know, pick your number, 320 is what you've got, but it could be something else. Along with these three options, what are we promising the taxpayers? What are the limits to what the district can do with either budget or scope post bond passage? And I've got one more, maybe, I don't know if this fits in the same discussion, but I wonder what has happened to these conceptual master plans given the vision we heard from Miss Adams last week that was certainly not specific about changing anything particular here, but certainly had great visions for the Jefferson campus. So if that vision were to move forward, do we just toss these master plans, or where are we? Because ultimately we're here today to talk about how we price something, but it seems like we need to know what we're pricing. I got 8 questions in there, I know, but sorry.
This is Director Constam. Sorry, I missed the beginning of the meeting. Kevin, I think I can respond to a couple of your questions. One is that, yes, these conceptual master plans have come before the board. Yeah, all of them. Is that right? Has Wilson? Dan?
Yes, they've all been presented, and we've given the budget numbers as well.
Yeah, yeah. And then Kevin, your question is a really great one around what is our commitment to the voters. I remember, you know, the BAC rather vehemently disagreeing with the board significant scope changes on the 2017 work and relatively little appetite for significant value engineering in an effort to try to bring those costs closer to the original estimates. A lot of reasons for that, but I remember we had this same conversation with the BAC back then. So you're right to ask it, and it's something that the board needs to consider and have dialogue around. And on your last question around the Albina vision, we had we have not yet had conversation about what additional elements we might add into the bond. I think it's safe to assume that the vision for Jefferson High School itself remains the same. I think the other question is just whether the board is interested in potentially adding any additional elements, for example, master planning for relocation for Harriet Tubman Middle School, or facilities improvements for some of our North and Northeast Portland elementary schools. We have not yet had that conversation. And obviously time is, you know, drawing short here. I don't know if any of the other board members who are on here want to add to any of those answers to Kevin's questions.
Yeah, this is Director Bailey. I think we have a number of unresolved issues still. One is we haven't matched our high school capacity to projected enrollment. And if we were to build the next 3 high schools out to 1,700, we would, according to current enrollment projections, we would have significant overcapacity. Second concern is I think if we do not stick to the original footprint of Jefferson, there would be significant cost savings. And that gets to kind of your first question, Kevin, about was the DAG given a budget, or were they just said dream big? And that's in it. The budget issue is so both those issues are a big deal for me. And I guess third, given the Albina Vision Plan, it's kind of added a few things to think about. But we certainly haven't landed on anything yet. And yeah, time is growing short. We're trying to match our very short-term planning process to a longer-term vision, and that's a real challenge.
Director Bailey, if I can just clarify one thing that you said. You mentioned if we were to change the footprint of Jefferson High School, I think you're not just talking about whether or not something would be added or modified, but whether or not we would consider just building an entirely new structure there, which would probably allow us to realize some cost savings. And when the master planning group had those conversations, it was really in more of a sentimental vein around how do you feel about the history of this architecture, rather than faced with a stark choice like, we can save $50 million and invest it at Boise Elliott. What would you think about that?
I'd also like to jump in because I've challenged the population projections that came from PSU's Center for Demographics, or whatever it's called. We have a very low enrollment at Jefferson currently, and we have low enrollment in part because kids that live in the neighborhood aren't required to attend there. It also reflects a lack of investment in the building and its programs. And when kids have a choice to go somewhere else, they're going to go to the choices that have more programming that suits them. The population projections were done before the residential infill project was completed, which was just this spring, and approved by City Council. And that increases urban lot sizes, the standard 150 by 100 lot size. It allows building 2 homes on that one lot. It also includes you could have an ADU on that lot as well, or 2 ADUs in addition to the single family home. I think that with some of the efforts that are happening around planning for increased density, preference policy that the City of Portland Housing Bureau is using, we need to understand that the population will come back. And I know we haven't had the discussion about whether Jefferson's a neighborhood school or not. But if we're building 100-year schools, we need to think not just in our, current projections, but think out into the future what our city in this area might look like in 100 years.
So this is Julia Brim Edwards. The only thing I want to add is to Kevin's question. Well, first of all, I want to just acknowledge Michelle's comments, because I think we should make sure to take those into consideration when we're looking at the enrollment at the current enrollment at the school. But I want to go back to Kevin's comment, or the question about are we going to deliver the schools that we promised the voters, or the budget we promised the voters? And that was a position that the board found itself in after the measure had passed, and it looked like we couldn't necessarily build the schools that we had told voters that would be built with the budgets. And I think part of this process right now is to marry up those two to make sure that we don't go to the ballot with a budget that is significantly below what we think it should be for the schools to meet the ed specs, the sustainability, and all the other requirements. So hopefully through this process, we don't end with such a big delta between here's the school we promised and the budget we promised. So hopefully this process will bring those two concepts together. But it's the exact right question for us to ask.
And can I add in my 2 cents? This is Rita Moore. I seem to remember when this came before the board that I and maybe other board members asked for a cost estimate on, or asked whether there had been any cost estimate on demolition, partial demolition, full demolition, and a complete rebuild. And I think the answer we got was that no, that had not been done. And I think I asked for it to be looked at. And has anything been done around that in the interim?
This is Dan. Yeah, I apologize. I know there were some discussions around what the cost would be if it was a replacement. I apologize. I don't remember a specific direction to go get additional cost estimates for what that would be. So I'll say that that's on me. We do not have a cost estimate from an estimator of what that would be.
Dan, how quickly do you think that could be done if there were such a directive? Would it really be an extrapolation of, you know, other similar projects, or how labor intensive is that?
A good question, and I think it probably depends on what level of detail. I think something to point out as the BAC looks at these cost estimates, as the BAC looks at the process, I think one of the things that the board, and this is maybe me making some assumptions, wants to hear from the BAC was, what did the district do when they prepared these budgets? Specifically, the process. Was the process deliberate? Was the process clear? Are the assumptions that are gone into this, are they reasonable? Are they clear? And I think what we've done is, I think we've done a good job of that, saying this is exactly what we're going to do. We've gone out and did it. We have presented that information, and I think we've been clear presenting the data that we have, the assumptions that we have put into those estimates. And so what we have for Jefferson, for example, are multiple options with budget numbers to that. If there is a desire to go forward with something else, if there's a desire to say, let's look at what something could be new construction, we could certainly have someone turn something around quickly, but it wouldn't have this level of detail, most likely. It's probably going to be more of, here is a cost per square foot assumption times a size assumption. The building's certainly going to be a different shape to some degree if it's new construction versus renovation. And as long as we're clear, this is what we're basing our numbers and our assumptions on, I mean, I think that's totally fine. There's no issue with doing that. Similarly, I don't think with the data that we have prepared, there's any problem with the board saying, we want to go a different direction. We just simply want to, we have a cap, or we have a number that we want to hit. And therefore that is what is approved. And as we go through design and as we go through planning and construction, if we have to make hard decisions to hit that number, then we will make hard decisions to hit that number. That is a totally legitimate option as well.
Except the difficulty is, I personally would not feel comfortable doing that unencumbered by actual information. This is not my field. So I'm not in a position to even guess how much, what the difference might be between a modernization and a rebuild. So it would, for me, it would be helpful even to get a ballpark number at this point. what I do not want to have happen is, because we're about to start I expect a big community conversation about, dreaming big about a number of things in that area. I don't want to be making promises that we're not going to be able to keep. I don't want to underestimate the cost. So any information that you could give us on even whether it's likely a rebuild would save money over a modernization, I think it would be helpful.
I'd like to ask a clarifying question too, and I should know this, but the difference between a modernization and a rebuild, and where that, if the facade is maintained in some of the architectural or historical features in one scenario versus the other. And the other thing is it's either scope, calendar, or budget that has to give when you get to a pinch point. You already know this. So which one of those are we willing to play with or toss out?
Yeah, two great questions. The rebuild versus modernization, that's a great question. It's really just terminology that we have used for when we're doing something that's substantially a renovation, we call it a modernization, even though all of our modernizations have included some new construction components as well, versus a Lincoln or a Kellogg where it's virtually all new construction, we call it a rebuild. So it's just really internal terminology. And I've just blanked on your second question, Michelle. What was your second one? I apologize.
So the question was, one question was about the modernization versus rebuild. The other one was, of the three things that you can give up in any project like this, scope, calendar, or budget, which one are we willing to be more flexible with? Because it's usually one of those things that has to give. Sure,
that's great, and I always love the context, or appreciate the context of the three-legged stool. I'm not probably the one to say which is the driver. I would say recent history. When we've targeted a school opening date, we've always looked really hard to hit that date that school opens, and we have hit all of those dates. So schedule, one could certainly argue, has been the primary principle. To Kevin's comment, after the 2017 bond passed and it became clear that the projects needed additional funds to hit the scope, the identified scope, that was the question that was put before the board. There's probably no necessarily right or wrong answer. It's just what is the best for the district, what is best for the students. And that decision was to retain the scope and increase the budgets of those projects. This is super good conversation and a very important topic. We have quite a few others, and we do want to be a little bit cognizant of time. So I think for the moment, what I'll do is Beth had a question in the chat about the engagement, and I'll answer it real quickly, and then Steve Efros can jump in if I got anything wrong, and then we can follow with more detail as well. And that is for the conceptual master plans, we just did a handful, I think Steve said for Jefferson, 5 public meetings. And because the point was to get to a generalized scope with an associated budget. When we go forward with these projects, we will do much more in-depth community engagement. And we outline who our stakeholders are, community engagement, and we create these community engagement plans. And I think that's something that we heard from the Jefferson community was, you're going to need more of this. You're not getting all of our input. You're going to need more, and that's something that we heard. Beth, you're on mute.
I'd like to know the number of people at those 5 meetings, not the number of meetings.
Oh, I see. I think, Steve, if you want to give a generalized answer, then I'm sure we can get you some more specifics.
I think it was about 25. I think typically there were close to 25 or sometimes 30 people within each of the conceptual master planning committees. And that's probably a good workable size. You get significantly larger, it gets hard to manage. But again, I think in some ways it probably was a little smaller than it might be in a comprehensive master planning process as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think for the sake of time, we'll move on, not from the Jefferson project, but I think we want to talk a little bit about the budgets, and specifically, we did want to talk about escalation. That's a topic that came up last time. So Marina, would you like to talk about that?
Thank you, Dan. So just kind of quickly to go back to the cost estimates that we had presented. I don't know if you're going to share that presentation again, Dan?
I will.
Thank you. So we had hard costs that we got from the professional cost estimator for each of those conceptual master plans, and those were our starting points for the costs, all of the soft costs that go along with that. Those hard costs included estimating contingency, so that number was already in there. We also added on then soft costs, FF&E, project contingency, and escalation. Swing sites were estimated by the cost estimator as part of the conceptual master plan, so they're included in that hard cost as well. For the soft cost numbers, we've actually reviewed all of this information with the BAC previously. We've provided backup documentation on what our historic costs have been, what other estimators recommend, both for soft costs, for FF&E, and also for contingency. And we modified some of our costs based on the feedback that we got from the BAC. So we ended up with 14% at our soft costs. We're at $27 a square foot for our FF&E. And then for contingency, standards within OSM are 15% for a renovation, 10% for a complete replacement. And the last but not least is escalation. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Scott Perella to talk a little bit about the escalation and how we came up with the numbers we did, which was the first year escalated at 5%. Remaining years, the midpoint of construction were escalated at 4%. So Scott, if you don't mind talking through what brought us to that point, and also what you've learned recently about escalation forecasts based on what's going on with the pandemic.
Right. So back when we jumped into working through the escalation calculations back, probably about January, really kind of working with our estimators and doing a lot of market research about what was going on in the market. And at that time, as we were looking at it, the estimators were all running at about 5-6%, and kind of looking out forward as to what the anticipated markets were going to be doing. If you remember back then, the general sense in the industry was that we were kind of at this crest of the hill, kind of looking at how things were going. Generally speaking, things were stable. The AIA billing index, which is how much architects are billing on a regular basis, was pretty stable in 2019. That they were seeing a little bit of a softening with construction starts, but generally speaking, everybody from the AIA to the AGC basically kind of felt that 2020 was going to be a fairly stable year, and that we were going to start to anticipate seeing some sort of market corrections in 2021. This goes all the way back to Ken Simonson, who's the chief economist from the AGC. And so that kind of led us to this idea of like, okay, all of our professional estimators were pretty confident in the idea of, you know, if you're looking at 5%, we're going to start to see things continue to soften a little bit more. So we'll step it down to about 4%. And so that's kind of what led us to that kind of perspective of where we're at. So we had seen that there was some slowdowns. You know, just to kind of refresh everybody's memory, according to the economists, there was about 30% of projects were reporting slowdowns or scaling back of projects, and about 15% were reporting projects were actually being canceled. So kind of to be expected. Ed Zarensky, who is one of the economists who reports for the Washington Post and others, tracks a lot of this kind of stuff. He's done 42 years of construction, and 30 of those have been in estimating and forecasting. And what he had been tracking was, you know, construction volume was starting to slow down for the last 4 out of 6 quarters, so kind of in support of all that. So again, imagine you're at the crest of the hill and we're coming down now into a slight decline and anticipating that we're going to pick up speed. So now we fast forward and we have an additional 6 months of understanding of what all of this means. And we've gone from not just a market correction from an extremely volatile, hot construction market. Now we've put the pandemic in there. And long story short, it's kind of anybody's guess as to what's going to happen. There's a lot of feedback, a lot of contradictory viewpoints. If you ask 5 economists and 5 estimators, you're going to get 5 different answers because of everything that's going on. And the critical element of what we're at this point is that the concern and the focus of all of the professionals that deal with the forecasting is that the industry itself in the last 6 months has started a shift from that this is now a temporary slowdown, a temporary suspension of work with some clients, particularly on the private side, maybe canceling projects, to now we're starting to look at a pure reduction in starts. Now, for those of you who remember back in 2008, which was the start of the Great Recession, that was one of the key indicators, is that what really drove a lot of the market conditions was not that things were getting slowed down, but what we saw was there was a break in the cycle. We started to see lots of projects being canceled in the planning stages. And then that translated then into the design stages. So nothing was being planned, then it was nothing being planned or designed. And as the recession continued, we got into nothing was being planned, nothing was being designed, and the construction companies were tearing through the backlog and there was nothing being worked on. Well, we're starting to see those sorts of things now. So Ed Zarinsky, again, the economist for the Washington Post, is talking about the critical element is to start looking at the fact that we are starting to see a reduction in starts. Overall, spending is being kept up by a lot of good things. The Paycheck Protection Program from the federal government, and they think that that's really kind of helping keep a lot of the construction industry buoyed right now. But the construction industry lost, last one I saw, they lost 16.6% of the workforce in April, and they lost another 12.7% in May. And so significant reductions in the workforce. AGC is even saying that so far the industry is pretty short on staff, but there could be even more layoffs coming down in the future. All the way down into the construction industry right now is ranked 4th as far as firms who are taking out loans against the Paycheck Protection Program. So quite a bit going on there as far as what's holding up the industry right now. Now, one of the other big things that we're seeing right now, and this is in discussions with RLB, who is our estimator, and they've got offices all over the world. They track this stuff all the time. What they're tracking is that what was a stable architectural billing index in 2019 has seen a steady decline in the last 4 months, month after month, in the billing index. So that what that tells us is that it's not a one month glitch. It's not things kind of got delayed for 4 weeks. It's that we're starting to see a break in the cycle of things are not being designed at this point. If that makes sense and tracks.
Hey, Scott.
And so, yeah.
Did you say that construction employment declined in May as well as April?
Yeah, they said, according to ENR, they were tracking a 16.6% reduction in April and a 12.7% in May.
Because
that's compared.
That's not what the Bureau of Labor Statistics said. There was about 1 million drop in jobs in April, and almost half of that came back in May.
In Oregon, is that a?
That was national. Are you talking Oregon?
Okay, and Scott, that might be some of the stuff where we see different groups coming in with different information. I was just going off of what I was tracking within ENR. And I can send you that article, and I'd love your feedback on that. Of what we're trying to do is we're trying to triangulate a lot of different perspectives on what's happening as we looking into the future. So where a lot of this leads to is that we've been talking with RLB, who's our estimator, again, and basically what they're anticipating at this point is they do see a reduction in the escalation rates in 2020. They just for that year, we were tracking at 5 to 6%. They're now projecting really more of a 4% for 2020 and a drop to 3% for 2021, and then 2% on average per year beyond that as you get further out. The trick becomes is that, again, listening to Ed Zorinsky talk, the crux is going to become is that the competitive environment will really benefit owners to the extent that as workload drops, the bidding environment should get more competitive, numbers should get better, pencils will get sharper, unless we get to a point where the production supply chain starts to get disrupted, where jobs are being lost of we're not producing the materials to be used. And so that's where a lot of the debate comes is that is it going to be just a competitive market and great bidding environment, or is it the fact that we're not going to be able to get the materials? Are we not going to be able to, now they were talking about steel is a big element right now because 40% of steel production is used in construction. And so there's a lot going on there. Now the economists also got in.
Could you also talk about some of the things that are specific to the COVID? So the labor inefficiencies and the supply chain disruption issues, because this is a little bit, I think, unique compared to the recession of 2008.
Yep, I was just headed there. So one of the things we also were talking with them about was what are we seeing specific to the COVID inefficiencies? Now, another one of our professional estimators is Cummins Corporation. They're currently estimating Kellogg, I believe it is, as well as some others. And what they're currently tracking is on average anywhere from a 3 to 5% inefficiency with labor crews in the field directly to the installation work that it needs to happen. Now, this comes in a variety of measures, and different trades are affected differently. So earthwork subcontractors aren't generally affected because most of the time it's one person in a giant piece of equipment. They got one guy on the ground, but they've got social distancing. We're good to go. If you get into the HVAC guys who are trying to lift heavy units into the ceiling spaces, it takes 2 or 3 people to lift them. Now we get challenges of how do we deal with that with social distancing. It's taking more man lifts. So GCs are on the rise. You can't have 2 guys in a common man lift because we can't maintain social distancing. I did some more research, and again, back into ENR, they were tracking a report by Leeds, which is a consultant in the UK. And what they're seeing is they tracked across 70 projects. They saw early on about a 20% inefficiency rating due to COVID, and they're seeing it climb as they start to take into account impacts from supply chain disruption. So it's not just the guys in the field anymore, it's the ability to get the materials. Now, I would assume
Scott, can I jump in for a second? This is Kevin.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It seems like maybe we're mixing up some things here, because the way I see this is that the effect of COVID today on inefficiencies, etc., are real for sure, but their effect on this program, on the PPS program, will be in presumably claims on existing work. So it's not an issue for estimating future work, with perhaps the exception of Benson. What I think we're really struggling for here is what is the post-COVID escalation going to be? And because we're talking, 2, 3, 4 years out here, and all of us could come up with a number, and I think we'd all have equal chance of being right. But we do have access to some people who do this stuff every day, and it just seems to me like, in terms of these kinds of estimates, like Jefferson, which is out some years, it's worthwhile asking specifically, maybe we have to pay them. I don't know how this works, but ask some of these experts, what should we be putting in? Because, Scott thinks it should be 3%. I think it should be -3. Dan thinks it should be 4.5. Who knows? But at least we should try to find someone who's smarter than all of us, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, and so and we asked that question of Dan Youngie from RLB, and that's where the 4% in 2020, 3% in 2021, 2% per annum going on with, if you assume for a long-term bond program, their assumption as RLB is that you should net out on average somewhere around 2% per year. Now, that being said, I get that people may feel like COVID is a current bond program issue. The problem is that COVID-19 is not going away, and what we're starting to see is it is creating ripple effects in the industry, and it's going to start to span into the future years. And what does that mean? And as we've seen, one of the things I was tracking is that we're going to start, and it's anticipated that we're going to start and see struggles with certified firms, because it's the smaller shops that are having troubles in these slowdowns. And as we move into reduction of projects and reduction of backlog, that those are the firms that are struggling. And so what does that mean long term? I think there's a lot of things that are going to have a ripple effect. We do have some numbers from RLB, but as you said, Kevin, your guess is as good as mine, is as good as RLB or Cummins or Construction Focus or any of our estimators. Nobody knows really where we're headed with it all. We're getting into material shortages are now starting to come into effect. They account for 7% of the inefficiencies in COVID based off of that UK study. So that's a material shortage issue. And until those firms can get materials back into the supply chain, we don't know how long that's going to be an impact. Ultimately, what it gets down to is, even the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, is even saying none of us really have an idea of what it means in 2020 or what 2021 is going to look like. So it's kind of take your best guess, plan contingencies, and we'll see where it goes.
Maybe I can jump in here to wrap up this topic a little bit. And I think this is a great, thank you for all that insight and input. I think this is a good one for the BAC to opine on some recommendations here. What we had been carrying for all of our projects was 5% for the first year and 4% for the following year. And that came from talking to different folks, but largely from talking to RLB. And that was, end of 2019, early 2020. We're in a bit of a different environment now. I think what Scott has put out there is we're hearing a lot of different things. RLB has said they might start estimating 4% for next year, 3% for, I think, the 2 years after that, and then dropping it down after that. And so what we do for our projects is we take an escalation rate and then multiply it by a number of years, of course, and that is to the midpoint of construction. Dropping it down in such an uncertain future significantly would give me pause. I think that would be high risk considering we're going into a pretty unknown environment. Things could get better, things could get worse. I'd be interested to hear the BAC's recommendation for how we treat escalation. Knowing the numbers, here's Jefferson as an example, you can see what the impact is to Jefferson on the 5 and 4%. Is there a recommendation from the BAC to change that?
Well, I'll jump in again, and I'd welcome other members. Again, I don't think, certainly speaking for myself, I have no special expertise in predicting what this escalation would be, but we do have access to RLB and 2 or 3 other firms, right? So I would say we need their best input, and then we can make a judgment, certainly, and you can make a judgment. I don't think any of us are going to say that RLB is wrong, you know, that they're overstating this or they're understating it, because that's what they do all the time, and we don't. So I guess that's what I would say. Let's engage the professionals just like we would for the hard costs. I mean, we don't come in and say that they're pricing steel too high or too low. What we want to know is that you're having the right people price this stuff. And I think that's what we should do with escalation too.
Dan, this is Greg. The other question would be, I agree with what Kevin said. The other question would be, what is the difference in the escalation costs between the 5.4 versus 5.432? Are we talking $1 or $2 million over this entire, the project? We're talking 10 million. And I'm looking at those percentages. I'm not sure the difference between 5.4 versus 5.432 is going to generate a great difference in money. And given where you are in a bond sale, where you want to have enough money to make sure that you can complete these projects, this is not perhaps the time where you get, you want to be conservative in your estimating, not more liberal in it.
Other feedback from BAC members?
This is Tom speaking. I would concur with Kevin and Greg that at this point it sounds it's going to be too hard to predict, and so let's rely on the estimators and maybe be slightly conservative. We also know from experience that oftentimes the numbers come in higher anyway once you get the contractor on board. So I'm thinking you go with what RLB recommends, be slightly conservative, and we'll see how it plays out. But otherwise we'll be second guessing ourselves all through this process.
I agree, and I would just like to add that it's important to inform the public, and maybe even in the bond, that there's not as much predictability in these numbers as maybe there was 10 years ago.
This is Dick Steinberg, and with the comments that have been made, it seems to me one of the other dilemmas we sort through is the timeline. We don't really know the full content of the 2020 bond program yet, and there's a relationship obviously between the schedule of the major projects that are laid out and what the final dollar impact is of escalation, regardless of what the percentage factors are. And so we're still flying a little bit blind because I think because we don't have a firm handle on what the schedule will be, or even how many high schools will be in it, and you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, a couple of comments, and then maybe we'll move on topics. And to Dick's point there, I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, construction cost escalation is two factors. It's a rate times a number. And so when we're dealing with lots of different variables, we're dealing with different scopes of work, we're dealing with different potential timelines, we're dealing with different potential durations of the bond. All those things factor in. And there are, a number of different scenarios. So as we're planning, what we're trying to do is say we're being deliberate about how we're doing that. We want people to understand our assumptions. So we look at that rate. And then what we've also done is for all of the high schools, we've created an assumed schedule. So that is an assumed schedule. That doesn't mean it's going to be the eventual schedule. That could change, but it's an assumed schedule. So that is what we use for when we create the escalation. And to Greg's point, how much does this matter? It's a great question, because when you look at the different scopes of work, it depends. So for Jefferson, it matters, somewhat significantly, I would say, because it's a pretty defined scope of work. It's a specific school. We have certainly some standards that we're going to design and build to. And when you're compounding rates of 9 figures over multiple years, that starts to add up pretty quick. Our other scopes of work, or projects, or you want to categories of work, they're more of a range. They're less defined. So getting into what the escalation goes into those, I certainly wouldn't say isn't important, but it really starts to factor in with all these other variables of, we have a range of scope that we want to hit. We've got a range of the number of roofs that we want to be able to replace over the course of this. But the escalation really would just probably move us a little bit within that range versus something that is a more specified scope of work. With that, I will move us along. I think we have one more topic in the modernization category, and then we're going to move into the other categories of work. So let me present again.
Dan, can I just jump in there? Because I think I've been thinking about this in terms of a program-wide rather than project-based. And we have, currently, there's about $105 million assigned to escalation. So it's not insignificant. I mean, that's all I would say. It's if it's, if we're going to adjust 0.5%, not a big deal. But if it's more significant than that, maybe it's important. So.
Yeah, good point. So speaking of less defined scopes of work, let's see if I can make this work. A few weeks back now, an option was developed that looked at if specifically if Cleveland and Wilson were not in the bond program in their totality, could we put funds in there that would complete a significant portion of their planning and design? Ostensibly, we'd have to define that, but maybe that would be to get us up to the point of construction. The variable of timing plays huge there, so that would be hard to say, yes, that will get us up to construction, because I think the timing question is too big of an unknown. That said, generally, if that's what we might want to endeavor for, what would the cost be to get us to that point or somewhere around that point? So we took a very quick look at it, and we estimated, based upon the categories of work of how we estimate, to the design portion costs would be roughly 75% of our soft costs. I'd say that's design and other expenditures. And then if we selected 5% of that project contingency, that would probably get us close. And I say probably get us close. Here are the cost numbers for Wilson and Cleveland. So Wilson's in the left category. You see the hard costs and the soft costs, and Cleveland's in the right column. The down below where it says soft costs at 75%, that is taking that soft cost number, multiplying it by 3/4, and then contingency, the project contingency at 5%, and then totaling that. And so those are $17 to $20 million, about 7% of the project total, which averages a little under $19 million. Lincoln and high school, well, we went back and looked at where they were when they started construction. They were about at 5% at the beginning of construction. Projects are different. Certainly projects that are phased are different. Wilson could be an occupied phased project. That could look pretty different than what Lincoln or Madison looks like. Cutting to the point of, we estimated for the scope of work, $20 million is probably about adequate to get significant or the majority of design work done and get you close to the point of construction. But I'm looking for BAC feedback on this. Is that the right tack to take, or is there another way? Does this seem like a reasonable approach?
Dan, I have a question that's not particularly related to the numbers, but it's more about the choice to do this. What are your thoughts about, what we've done with all the high schools so far has been engage a CMGC at early stage of design, etc. And we all know the alleged benefits of doing that, getting a contractor who will be at risk being part of the design process. So how would we deal with that, or would we lose that potential benefit if we went this way?
It's a great question, and there's a lot of variables to it. One, it would add complexity if, from a very linear standpoint, if we took a project, we encumbered design, we did the design. Most of our large projects are CMGC. There's a good rationale for that. And then we wanted to depart into a GMP, a CMGC project. We would most likely need to bring, a contractor on early, but that wouldn't be for the full project. That would be just for pre-construction services. That would add complexities, which I think we could work around those. We'd have to get creative. We would do that. It's not our typical process, but it's something that we could do. Just another variable to throw in here of why this one is hard to pin down and why I was so vague, I guess, about what the scope would specifically be. I mean, one thing to point out is if we allocated 20 million to each one of these projects and we only needed 15, well, that other 5 would just roll into the project. The intent of this is for another upcoming bond to pay for the full construction of these. So this would be to get to a starting point and then roll into construction that's approved through another bond. The timing of a future bond is undetermined, and therefore that will play into when you would start design, because you wouldn't want to do design and then put it on the shelf for any period of time, extended period of time before you start construction. I bring that up just to kind of talk about some of the different variables that come into play here. For example, if we didn't go out for a bond until 2024, the earliest we would start construction presumably would be summer of 2025. We wouldn't start design probably until 2023. So these funds would be there for that purpose. They wouldn't necessarily be expended early on. They would be expended in accordance with that ultimate project schedule. So we may still be able to bring that CMGC contractor on board on time, depending on that ultimate schedule. That was a lot of words, and that was probably fairly confusing. It was just trying to note some of the other factors that are in here.
So Dan, this is Greg.
Hey, Dan, this is Tom. So all right, who's going to go first?
Go ahead, Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay. All right, thanks, Greg. I guess my question is when would the next bond be? Anyway, are they 5? I'm trying to remember. Are they 5 years out or 4 years out?
Short answer is that would be to be determined. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
The previous, it was going to every so many, and then the idea was that you keep the momentum and you retire the bonds, and so the net impact to the voters was kind of neutral going forward after the initial bond. It seems to me it'd be helpful to understand how this strategy is going to work out from a bond program is the timing of the bonds, to understand whether it makes sense to include those additional dollars in there or not. That's my thought.
Yeah, good question. And sorry for interrupting you there, Tom. where we are now, the bond options that are being reviewed and that we're getting public feedback on range from approximately 2 years. So that would mean going out again in 2022, or 4 years going out in 2024. That said, the decision of when that would happen, or potentially a different time, would have to be made later. The intent of including this scope is to keep that momentum, to say that regardless of when, we do plan on continuing with this sequence of bonds. The district and board leadership, everyone have been very clear that the intent is to keep the tax rate the same and not increase the tax rate as we go through these series of bonds. And so what this is signaling, is putting significant funds to, is this continuation of the capital program, and specifically continuation of the high schools as the first efforts with Cleveland and Wilson. Greg, I think you had a question too.
Well, no, I followed along that. I mean, my basic question was, why do this? Why not continue the way you've done it in the past, where you did a whole high school within a bond measure, including design, everything was within one bond measure? And you've answered that. That really is a policy question for your board. From our perspective, I think Kevin said it correctly. Will we be able to take advantage of the way you've done things before, doing this method versus the method previously, where you just had a whole project in one? But it's really more policy.
So Dick Steinberger here. Certainly a policy question. It strikes me just kind of off the top of my head, just throw it out for food for thought, that there may be an advantage of going perhaps only as far as SD. So that you have a really well-defined scope with an attached cost estimate based on today's prices, obviously. But then you would be in a really good position to perhaps tweak that a little bit for a pretty firm number when you went out for the next bond, asking for the rest of the money. So I think some of the challenges that have existed in the past have been not perhaps enough time to do as much detailed upfront planning as would have been beneficial on some of the prior projects. So maybe this is an opportunity to nail that without. The other thing, a risk of going too far, is codes change, and then you end up having to do a lot of redesign if the designs sit on the shelf for a long time.
Yeah, agreed. Like that's definitely a danger of designing something, putting it on the shelf, and then it not being valid anymore. And certainly there are scope and there are policy questions that need to happen here. And when we ask for feedback, we're not obviously asking the BAC to make decisions on the spot, but what we're trying to do here is show that as scope is developed or put forward, we're trying to have a deliberate and logical way for aligning the budget with that scope. And so this is one, or the way that we put forward for how we might estimate a budget amount for the design for these other high schools. We can come back to this if needs be. And again, we're getting, I want to be cognizant of time. We have someone here, our CIO, who can walk through our technology component. And I know Don Wolf, and he has to go here pretty soon. He's got a 3:30 stop. So I'd like to do is move on to some of our educational components, walk through some of those quickly, and get feedback, and then move on from there if that works for everyone. So Don, would you like me to present, or would you like it?
Well, I will just ask a question. Good afternoon, everyone. This is my first opportunity to actually have a reason to stand before you in this vein. So I don't know if everybody has the spreadsheet that has our calculations in front of them they're looking at, or would it actually be helpful? I found it's hard to kind of read these types of documents from a screen if you're really wanting to talk about numbers. I don't have, what I have is the four major components: our infrastructure and security, the device replacement, our classroom modernization, the ERP replacement, and the implementation services. And they're just broken down based on our estimates and the assumptions we put to those. With 5 minutes, I don't know that I want to try and walk through all of those. I think it might be more pertinent and maybe more valuable for you all if you've seen the document before. I know Dan sent it out a couple of weeks ago. If there are any particular questions or concerns about the logic that was placed on building these estimates. These are a little bit more straightforward than designing and building a new modernized building from scratch. So I won't be offended if there are none.
Don, this is Kevin. I have some questions which are going to probably seem naive just because I don't really, I certainly don't have any way of challenging your hard costs. I mean, I think the things that we can look at are the contingencies, the soft cost escalation, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So my question about these is the logic behind the numbers you've used. So for instance, you've got a whole separate section for implementation services, right? Which totals about $15 million. My question is, are we doubling up when we apply soft costs to each of the hard numbers, if you like, and then hiring implementation services as well?
No. So, that's a good point, and it's a good comparator. And these estimate costs and the way we apply them are a little bit different. I tried to use Dan's standard format so it would be familiar. But the way we do these, so if we look at the device replacement, and we'll just take that very first chunk where we have estimating contingency at 10%, soft costs at 15%. And in our mind, when we look at those soft costs, we include for that particular one, things like a case for the device. We know what a hard cost for a device is. The soft cost would be a device case and an extra power supply. And that's about a 15%. It's not a personnel cost that we're looking at when we talk about soft costs in most of these instances. Classroom modernization, we talk about soft costs. There's part of that is contingency in the construction, but there's soft costs in terms of there may have been a bad logic in assuming what we could put in one building versus another. And so we look at a soft cost and being an equipment cost or a type of connector that we might have to buy. And so that's how we apply the soft cost to these, which is, from what I'm gathering, what I'm learning in all of this process is very different than how we do it in the construction side of the house.
Okay, fair enough. And again, these questions are naive, I think. You've got contingency on new Chromebooks, for instance. And it seems to me we know what a Chromebook costs, and if this passes, we just order them and there we go, right?
Yeah, there's a potential, but much like we're seeing in the labor market, there is a chip shortage going on internationally. And so the cost, we've seen a wide swing in costs on what we'd like to have versus what we can get. What's available now tends to have a poorer chipset because they're more widely available. The Intel chipset, which we're hoping to get, is, supply is shrinking because the demand has gone way up across the globe. And so those prices are going up. So we're not certain what we'll be able to order in November, where we're going to be at in a pandemic state. And we also have to factor in, we're not going to order all of these all at once. We can't deliver them all at once, so we don't want them sitting on the shelf, losing warranty, losing life cycle. So it will be a phased order as we get them, and we won't know what the future is going to hold on that, on what that next batch would order. So
okay. And I guess for others who are listening, the questions I'm asking you really apply to all of the other pieces of work, just because I think applying contingencies and soft costs, etc., differ in each of these packages of work than they do in Jefferson High School, for instance. So I just want to be sure that people have been thinking about how that works. Another kind of question that applies to a number of these, there are notes here that talk about 4 years, and I just wonder if, and that's true of some other pieces of work too. I just wonder, and maybe this is more directed at Dan. I just wonder if, you know, if we really are going to have a 2-year bond here, should we continue to include in this bond package 4-year pieces of this kind of work, or should we defer some of those to, you know, the current time? And you don't have to answer that right now. I mean, it seems to me that's just something to be thinking about.
Can I take a crack at that from the two areas that I have, those 4 years, and those when we look at escalation costs, that would include that 4-year COLA is what we were thinking around that, or what we think the escalation costs for bringing those professional services in. This is a large enough scale in PPS when we're talking about hitting 100+ buildings and working in a longer term project, that if this bond is only 2 years, it doesn't make sense to start it for 2 years, stop that work, then go out for a bond and recapture the work again. It makes more sense to continue that role and extend what this 2-year funding for a bond is over the 4 years of implementation, so that we have continuity of effort. We've got some prices that are locked in. We know what we're going to be guaranteed for, and we don't lose momentum on making these projects move forward.
I believe Don has a hard stop. And so if there are other questions on the technology side, we are happy to follow up with those in writing.
Yeah, I'm happy to, Dan, if you don't have my email address yet, it's in the calendar invite, or Dan or Marina or anybody else can get it to you. Happy to take any questions and provide any detail that comes to mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. With that, I think we'll move on to our curriculum topic, and I believe we have Dr. Valentino on the line. Are you there, Luis? Okay, maybe not. Maybe we'll come back to that one. Maybe we'll find him. How about we move, so in our educational improvements categories, we're looking at 3 scopes of work: the technology, the curriculum, and the SPED classroom improvements. So John Lyons, would you like to talk about the SPED classrooms?
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. My name is John Lyons. I'm a senior program manager in the planning group. And I was also a project manager on the facility condition assessment. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk through the numbers with you. The numbers I'm going to show you do not differ from the spreadsheets that Dan has sent out, but I'm going to walk through them in a specific order. So what we're looking at here is the low value for SPED classroom improvements, and I'll start with the hard costs. The $16,000 represents a sum of furniture and equipment. That's just to buy the stuff. And the way that we arrived at that number is I worked closely with SPED leadership, and the spreadsheet I'm showing here, there's nothing specific here that's important, but just to show you, I worked with the SPED leadership to pick out equipment and sensory tools to equip these classrooms in an ideal format. And what you see in the totals here are around $16,000 to fully equip these self-contained classrooms. So here we have social emotional intensive skills and communication behavior. So hard cost $16,000. That's where that number came from. Had it a hefty estimated contingency, and that's just to account for variations across classrooms. We have 82 self-contained classrooms across the district. I've been to maybe 10 to 15%, and if anyone's familiar with SPED classrooms across the district, they defy generalization. They are all over the place in terms of their equipment and their physical support needs. Installation, 10% movers, and then we anticipate about a 16% growth, 8% per year in SPED classrooms. The escalation here is familiar, should be. It's borrowed from the other hard cost assumptions. So the other variants of this cost estimate grow concentrically from this amount. So if there are any questions about here, please let me know. Okay.
John, the 4.5 million is crossed out, right? And that's what's in one of the options, right? What's happening there?
Correct. So the 4.5 was based on, you can see the support contingency here is also crossed out. That was a goof of mine. So those costs are actually carried within an OSM budget. So that's been eliminated. We have also reduced the SPED classroom count growth from 32 to 16 and to account for the different bond term period.
Okay, so options 1 and 3 that's out before the public, the 4,500,000 will become 2,700,000. Is that what we're saying?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and I should have probably prefaced a little bit. So the option sheets that are out there, they're in the documents, but there's one that specifically goes over all the different options for the educational facility improvements. But we've continued to look at our costs, to sharpen our pencils as we've gone through this. And so John called it a goof, but I really just think it's refining our numbers, that as we went over these again, we realized that we had some double counting. So we removed those costs from this scope of work. And we're going to be doing a true up on effectively all of our numbers, or almost all of them, here over the next week or so.
Got it.
Okay, so I'm actually going to jump to the high-end cost estimate now, and just because the middle estimate is just the midpoint between the high and the low, so not a lot of explanation there. And what this high estimate includes is the furniture, like the physical products that we picked out with the SPED leadership, plus upgrades to acoustics, lighting. So this is switching fluorescent bulbs to dimmable LEDs, mechanical upgrades, technology upgrades, and then installation of built-in casework. So again, I have to emphasize there's a lot of variation in these classroom types. So this $40,000 number is just it's casting a wide net to account for this variation. So there's any number of order of magnitude construction costs included in this number here. Estimating contingency is the same. Installation would also cover movers, installers, and some installation and infrastructure upgrades. This high end also includes some of our learning resource centers. So not self-contained. Kids are not spending the full day typically in these classrooms, but they still have many of the same sensory needs as the kids who spend their full day in an ISC, SES, or CB classroom. SPED classroom count growth is the same. And then you're seeing here again, the revised number, 13.7 million. So I'll stop there if there's any questions.
Yeah, John, this is Greg. In terms of your typical classroom and the things that you bought, you've got two different estimates. Does either estimate work or not work better for what I call life cycle costing? In other words, if you were to add up not only the capital costs, but then the costs over time of these particular pieces of equipment you bought, does it matter? In other words, would you be better off spending the $40,000 because you got a better piece of equipment that lasts longer, takes less maintenance, etc.? Or no, it doesn't make no difference at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the stuff in terms of the FF&E for both estimates would be identical. So we're not necessarily buying better things or better equipment. There's just more scope included with this higher estimate. Did I understand your question correctly?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. If there aren't more questions on the special ed classrooms, we're going to keep trucking along, and we're going to jump into the physical facility scopes of work. Our Director of FAM Project Management Construction is going to talk through a couple of these. So Patrick, do you mind starting with roofs?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. All right, does everyone see what I'm looking at? It should be the roof estimate.
Looks good, Patrick.
Okay. I'll go through these at the top of the screen. So what we try to do is come up with what's our average roof area that we're going to be looking at. And this was based on the FCA information ranking our roofs from 1 to 2. We came up with a number of roughly 40,000 square foot, your average roof area. We utilized the historical cost data from the bond from previous projects, and that came out to $90 a square foot for hard cost. The difference between option A and option B are simply the total number of roofs that we think can be completed over a 3-year period. So option A is we assume that we're going to be doing 4 roofs per summer. We've, and I'll just go down some of these assumptions. We've, like I mentioned, we selected the roofs based upon the FCA ranking of 1 to 2. We assume a 3-year construction period. And then some of the things that go into a roof replacement project, and it's just not simply a roof replacement. It also involves many times asbestos insulation. You've got a roof level seismic piece that would be installing a new plywood diaphragm on our roofs typically. We also touch a lot of mechanical equipment, skylights, and then roof ladders and hatches. And many times expensive tapered insulation is required. And then, of course, our soft cost assumptions, which include design and engineering fees, permitting, third-party consulting services. We jumped down to our project contingency of 15%, which is historically what the bond is used for these type of projects. And then our escalation information, this gets us to 67 million. And I believe what we showed was 71 million, and that was adjusted because we adjusted our escalation. We were running out a little long, and now it's to 3 years at the midpoint.
Patrick,
yeah.
Patrick, I have a question. The same question comes up about the escalation. What should that number be? And I fully recognize that escalation on a roof may be different than escalation on Jefferson High School. So who knows what that should be? But
yeah.
Why are we accruing the full escalation for 3 years when we're doing some of these roofs before 3 years?
So the assumption is that if the bond passes in 2020, that first year of escalation would be 5% 2021, and then you're in design in 2021. You're not really doing any construction. You're starting your construction in 2022, and then at 2023, somewhere in there, you're at maybe your midpoint of construction. That was the rationale.
Okay, yeah. Fair enough.
And to throw in there, agreed. We have current roof funds and scope, so this will be an add-on to those to that effort. So that's why it doesn't start right away. Similarly, as Patrick said.
Keeping moving. Option B, like I mentioned before, the only change would be we're tackling 9 roofs over a span of 3 years instead of 12. And that gets us to our $50 million. And I think I'll jump to mechanical to keep moving, unless anyone has any other questions. If I can get here. So our mechanical estimates, this was a little more nebulous. We don't have a lot of great historical cost information on mechanical replacements. We did do, of course, the Tubman project, which was great, but the Tubman project was very unique. It had a very custom filtration system. It had a custom chiller. So we have some hard cost data from that, which is worked into this. And we also use the FCA cost information, which played into this as well. What this works out to is around $3 million per project. So we're assuming that we would do roughly five large mechanical projects for a total of 15 over a 3-year period. So we think it's going to be a mix of a partial replacement. Maybe we replace the hydronic piping in a school. And then maybe we do a full mechanical replacement. And so, one given year, maybe we do a full mechanical system replacement and 2 partial mechanical system replacements. So it is a little nebulous. We've also got this 5% estimating contingency in here. Because of just that, we don't have a lot of good historical cost information. So we felt 5% would be reasonable. There's a potential for SB 1149 and ETO reimbursement, which is exciting. We're going with the standard 20% soft costs, which again has design fees, permitting, third-party consulting services. We're using the 15% contingency, and then here's our escalation number again. The difference between option.
This is Tom.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, finish. Go ahead and finish, and I'll jump in.
Okay. Option B is just a reduction in the number of projects that we think we could do. So we're going from 15 to 9. Other than that, everything is essentially the same. So we've got 74 up top for option A and 44 for option B.
Okay, my question was, if I recall earlier, there was some new sustainable design, or I'm trying to think of the right term you used, that was a factor in some of the increased cost differences between the Franklin and Jefferson. And so I'm wondering, there's also opportunities with these mechanical system replacements to look at more than just placing one for one in kind and looking at it more from a total life cycle and perhaps gaining some other energy efficiency and operating savings. Is that being factored at all into these projects, or are they just, we got a unit that's wore out, we're just going to replace it as is? I'm just curious. It seems like there's an opportunity here, perhaps, to do more than just replace these systems.
Absolutely. These cost estimates don't factor in getting any reimbursement from SB 1149 or the Energy Trust, but I just noted that on here that we will definitely be looking to achieve the requirements and reimbursement from SB 1148 ETO. Like right now, we are doing projects. We're replacing some part of our mechanical systems right now as part of facilities work, and we go after SB 1149 and ETO funds on each of those. So it's definitely something we look at and we'll look at.
So if I understand, then that allows you to put in equipment than if you didn't have those funds available?
Yeah, it stretches our dollar, essentially. And many times we could get reimbursement up to 20% or more of the costs for the work. So it's very advantageous for us to do that. And so far, we've been very successful at that. It's a great program.
Okay.
Moving on to seismic. So seismic option A, I'll hit our hard costs. We don't have a ton of historical data, but we do have really good data so far. This hard cost, unit cost of $62 per square foot is based on the Hayhurst full seismic upgrade project. And it's phased, so part of it happened last year and part of it is ongoing right now. This is based on completing 3 sites, and we tried to target sites that are listed on the city's unreinforced masonry database list, and that also need to get their roof replaced so we can be as efficient as possible. There's a potential for SRGP funding for this work, which is exciting. And we'll go down in the soft costs, which is 20%, standard 15%, and then our escalation, which is not changed. So we're at that 15 million mark for option A. And option B, which I don't think we've listed this on the information you received, or maybe we did. Option B, the only difference is we're still targeting 3 sites, but we've swapped out 1 site for Markham School, which is a CSI/TSI Title I site, which is a little more square footage. So that's why you see an increase in cost from 15 to 17.6. And that, I think that sums it up. Does anyone have any questions?
I think one comment to make here on our physical facility improvements, these categories of work, they are more budget driven than they are scope driven. For example, we talked briefly last time about what bond language might look like and how that bond language would provide some certainty, but also flexibility. The 2017 bond has $150 million to do health and safety improvements. And then it identifies, I think it is 9 categories of those health and safety improvements. The requirement there is to spend $150 million. There is not a requirement on exactly what that is to achieve. Now, we've communicated our goals and we track against those similarly. But this is going to be something we anticipate to be something similar. We say we are allocating these funds. Here's what our targets are, but we are going to learn more as we go into this, especially when it comes to our mechanical systems. We do not have a lot of data on why they're performing so poorly. We have a lot of data that they are performing poorly. We had 6,000 work orders on mechanical systems last year, but not a ton of detail on how to properly address those. So just some context to these, the scope of these is more undefined and is more of a range, and whereas the budgets are, we anticipate to be more of a end up, if you will. Thank you, Patrick. I know we're over time.
So in other words, this could
go for time.
This could play out like the first bond measure where we had hoped to, but depending on how things play out, we may or may not be able to do all of that work. Is that a fair statement?
I think it is. So the 2012 bond had funds set aside for facility improvements. And then the language was an up to number. And then as as the high schools consumed, the scope of the high schools got larger, square footage got added, funds ended up being directed away towards high schools. The 2017, I think, is what we'll align closely more with for 2020. That's still TBD. And that is to say less, here's the number of projects, more of want the dollar amounts that we're going to spend. Here's our targets. So we're not going to leave that empty, but we want to spend a certain amount of funds.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're going to hit ADA. John, do you mind talking about ADA real quick? Our director of security, I think, is unavailable, so we might skip that one and follow up with that one in writing. But we should talk about time because we blew past our time limit. I can certainly stay for a little bit longer, but I wanted to check in if others, if they can or if they cannot. Seeing no computers turn off, we're going to keep plowing ahead at least for a few more.
Cool. I will breeze through this then. And please just start hollering if you have any questions. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay, talking about ADA, I'm going to start again with the lower amount. So just to talk about scope for a moment, what this lower amount of the ADA ask would be is one accessible school per configuration for each cluster. And we have the hard cost data for those schools from the FCA. Hard cost to get us to that scope would be $4.4 million. And then should be some familiar estimating contingencies, soft costs, and project contingencies. Please note, we have a little bit of a higher estimating contingency here because we're dealing with a higher number of variables, multiple trades, some more unknowns typically with ADA. Pause, any questions about this low end option? Okay. So moving on to the mid option, this is sibling to the lower option insofar as this is 2 K5s, 1 middle school, and 1 high school, completely accessible in each cluster. So the hard cost to get us to that scope is 6.7 million, and then the other factors here should be identical. So that gives us a revised total for at 13.8 million.
John, what are we doing at high schools? I mean, we just modernized several of them and others will be modernized. So what are we doing here?
That's a great question. So we still have Jefferson and Cleveland. So let's just look at the 11 million or this $9 million number. About $3 million of that is earmarked for Jefferson. If we were to go forward with the rebuild or modernization of Jefferson, my hope would be that that money would be redistributed to other accessibility projects. But there is a significant amount of accessibility work to happen at Jefferson. Cleveland is much less so. It's about $500,000 if memory serves. And there's a few dollars to spend at Wilson, but not much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And you're absolutely right. Franklin, Grant, 100% accessible. We have no money to spend there. Okay, so that's option. Okay, so the high option here, 28.5. The scope here would be main level accessibility district-wide. And that's a lot more buildings. And the reason I would say the cost isn't proportionally much larger is because we're excluding elevators with this. So this would just be site accessibility, main entrance, and then accessibility in and around the main level, including libraries, cafeterias, and gymnasiums. So, any questions about this? Okay.
Okay, thank you, John. With our last few minutes, presumably, I'll hit a couple of other topics and then we'll just open it up for questions. So I will look to go quick, but I'm very interested in feedback. Okay, I trust everyone can see the screen. Make sure I'm in the right spot. Okay, so we've covered our modernizations, our educational improvements, our facility improvements, a couple of exceptions. Oh, we did hit on capacity. We noted that in here. We've looked at tons and tons of options, as we mentioned last week. That could be in a potential bond, dozens and dozens of different scopes of work, including some different capacity or enrollment options that included opening schools that are closed, replacing modular classrooms, reconfiguring schools. Where we are right now is there's no specific capital improvements that we've identified that are related to capacity or enrollment changes. We are going through a district-wide multi-year enrollment process right now. So it's possible that in the coming years, there could be some capital need for capacity. So there has been some options discussed about having funds in there to address that if and when they arise. But currently, we aren't looking at any of the options include capacity. So I just wanted to note that. So we've been through these categories of work. Wanted to touch on administration. All of the options that we've used so far has been 5%. And using a percentage as we've gone through all the different iterations has been what we needed to do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to track administration very well. Historically, we've run about 5 to 6% for administration for the bond work, and that varies depending on the type of work. And certainly, as we look at options that we're looking at now, health and safety work is typically a higher percentage. It's more intensive. It just requires more work or a higher rate. Whereas scopes like technology and curriculum are going to have a lower percentage. We also need to be cognizant of compounding work. As we add more scope, certainly some scope comes on, but as we add more, we may need to add more staff, whether that be at project level or in procurement or in finance. We've definitely been looking at potentially adding more staff in the finance area. So those factor in as well. What we show here at the bottom is what we've been running for the 2017 program in at about 6%. So historically, we run about 5 to 6. Right now for 2017, all things included, we're at a little over 6%. But that includes bond issuance, the corporate activities tax, and our owner-controlled insurance program. So I think we'll ultimately recommend something somewhere in the 5 to 6% range, but would be interested in feedback before we land on anything.
Dan, in the absence of anything else, it seems to me that it may be back of the envelope, but it seems, given the mix of work here, that it would be worth sketching out a management plan and see what it comes to. Because you're right, health and safety, and some of the miscellaneous pieces of work here are going to have a higher percentage likely. So, I mean, that's what I would do. I wouldn't agonize over it, but I'd run out some numbers. It's like a contractor doing their general conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, in somewhat the same vein, and please feel free if there's other thoughts on that, is the program contingency. We've used 10% for all of the models and options that we've put out there. We would really like to stick with that 10%. We call it a good rule of thumb. I don't know if there is any specific standard. a couple things of note. Certainly, as we go into the COVID or this pandemic continues, it creates some more unknowns. Ultimately, the funds that are in a program contingency get spent on scope of work. So, there's always that's where the funds are ultimately allocated and spent. So it's nice to have that. And historically, in 2012 and 2017, after those bonds passed, we saw significant increases in discretionary scope of work that had impacts, of course. And neither of those bonds had significant program contingency. So that's something that we're interested in, and we've shown on all of our models, but would also be interested in hearing feedback from the BAC.
Dan, again, from my perspective, I'd like to see, a slightly more detailed analysis where, for instance, maybe 10% on Jefferson is appropriate. Curriculum, I mean, I wonder, really, do we need 10% program contingency on curriculum? And then when we're talking about some of these other scopes, as you said, they're kind of budget driven rather than scope. So if they're going to go over budget, then we reduce scope. So that seems like they've got their internal contingencies, and it doesn't make sense to me to apply 10% to budget driven work. But and maybe if you do that analysis, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. I don't know, but it seems like we should do that analysis.
Sure. What are others' feedback on this?
So just jumping in on that. So this would be 10% for Benson as well as Jeff plus the other programs, correct?
We have as 10% of everything.
So
on the
question, kind of going along with Kevin's thoughts, we know a lot more about Benson now than when we had the bond program. So to Kevin's point, does it make sense to apply that across the board as opposed to looking at each of the individual projects? And I would argue Benson, you have a design. Yes, there's some uncertainty, but you have a ton of contingency built into that one. You have a contractor on board, and so you should be. One more hope there would be less of these scope increases after the fact, as opposed to what you might experience on Jeff. So it kind of goes along with what I'm kind of the same opinion as Kevin. It's probably worth at least doing an analysis to justify whether that's the right number or not, or do you have a number that's based on each of the various scopes, maybe 10 or less in some cases. That's my thoughts.
Dick Steinberger here. For my 2 cents worth, I'm kind of okay with 10% across the board. And in my way of thinking, it maybe gets beyond the point of being able to do an analysis to support it. It falls, in my way of thinking, more in the category of the unknown unknowns, and as kind of a cushion against the unknown unknowns. And as Dan pointed out, which I think is an important point, that money would be used for work, not for overhead and other kinds of things. So if it turns out to be available, maybe you can do a couple more roofs or a couple more mechanical systems or a couple more somethings.
Okay, appreciate that. So next steps, there is a school improvement board committee tonight. Oh boy, that's coming up here soon. And then next week, I might have to double check this if it's been confirmed the last 2 days, but there's a work session that was going to be planned for next week. And when I typed this in here, that was still to be confirmed. So I'll need to double check that. But wanted to get the BAC's input on what the BAC's deliverable is after reviewing this information. I put a couple notes in here. We've talked about it before, but I don't think we have the clarity on exactly what that is. And so the first part I put in here is sort of what we talked about before, and some of this is probably my assumptions on what the board would like to hear from the BAC. Certainly, we talk about some specifics and costs, but I don't think anyone anticipates that the BAC is going to be able to dive into specific cost details and know how much Chromebooks really should cost and exactly what a roof replacement is, that sort of thing. More, I would anticipate the expectation would be, did the BAC review the cost methodology? Is that clear? Is it deliberate? Is it logical the way that staff is going about estimating these costs? We want to avoid being arbitrary and capricious. And then the assumptions, are those clear? Are those transparent? And are those reasonable based upon the best information? We will always want more information, and there's always going to be a desire to do better and get more information. But ultimately, we have to make decisions based upon the best available information. So are the assumptions that we're using now, are they reasonable and are they clear? So at the high level, I would anticipate that is something that the board would like to hear or hear your opinions on that. But there's also potentially some specific items that might be opinions or recommendations. I know a few of your, the amount for the 2017 projects, staff has a number, a little over $1 billion of what that is. Does the BAC see that as the right number, or do they see it as too risky and think that it should be increased? Or the program contingency that we just talked about, does that 10%, does that seem right? Is that the right way to manage risk, or should that be a different number? And there are a couple others in here. So I just put some things there for the BAC to react to. But I'd be interested to hear what the intention is as far as providing comments to the board.
Dan, my sense is that, after the last meeting, we sent you some, maybe big picture things to be thinking about. And I think we should do the same after this meeting so that you have the issues that were raised. And then I think it makes sense for you to reissue your estimates. It may look exactly the same, I don't know, but I would like to see your product after considering the input you've got from us, and then we can certainly comment on that. But if we were to go in today and say, well, we looked at all these numbers that are 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks old, and here are the things we raised. I don't think that gets them very far. But if we can take a look at what your quote final product would be, we could, I think, legitimately say, we asked you to consider XYZ. It looks like you did on X, looks like you didn't on Z, and here's whether we think that's problematic or not. And I think that would give the board a more succinct recommendation, it seems like. Now, time is an issue, I understand, but.
Okay, any other thoughts on how the BAC might provide information to the board?
I don't know if it's a thought, this is Greg, but it seems to me, are we going to provide it as a committee or individually? I would think we would provide it as a committee as opposed to them getting, I don't know how many on our committee, but 8 individual comments. We got to have it boiled down into some few. And, we just heard it today, although we've had it to look at. It will take us a couple days to think about it, and then we should probably feed our comments to Kevin it seems to me, to put together a report, such as it is, from our committee to the board for their consideration. And we as a committee should have a couple of days. I mean, I'm saying we need a deadline, and Kevin, so that Kevin can get the information and get it from you. So if we have any comments, we need to get them in by, what's today, Tuesday? We got to get them in probably before the weekend if you're going to get it, have any value to the board. So.
That's exactly the way it should work, Greg, I think. And I'd encourage not waiting till the weekend even. I mean, we got to get this thing moving if we can.
Well, Kevin, set a date. Tell us when you want our comments to you by, and that's when we have to get them done.
Let's do it by Thursday if that works for everyone.
Close the business Thursday.
I'll try and get a draft of issues out, maybe even tomorrow, so that everyone's not starting with a blank sheet of paper and go that way.
Okay, with that, I know we are well over, and some of us are going to another meeting here in a few. Any last questions before we sign off? I appreciate everyone's time. I appreciate everyone's input. Okay.
I'm good. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone.
This is Director Constam. I just want to echo what Dan said. We appreciate your service so much. It's so valuable to us. And I apologize for the tight timeline on which we're requesting your input, but we just really appreciate what you do and your role in this process. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. See you next time.